The air in Redemption Creek tastes of dust and disappointment. For Alara Vance, standing alone on the splintered train platform, it is the only thing she has left to her name. The steam from the departing locomotive clings to her simple wool dress, damp and heavy, like a shroud for the life she was supposed to begin. The man she had traveled over 1,000 miles to marry, a pig farmer named Jedediah Finch, had taken one look at her, his gaze sweeping over her travel-worn clothes and the absence of any fine luggage, and sneered. "I sent for a bride, not a beggar," he had declared, loud enough for the station master and a half-dozen loiterers to hear. "You've got nothing. No dowry, no family, not even a decent trunk. You'll be a drain before the first winter snow. I rescind the offer." And with that, he had turned his back, leaving her standing as the train, her last link to a world she once knew, chugged away into the vast, indifferent expanse of the West. She is stranded, a ghost at a wedding that will never happen, with nothing but the clothes she wears and a single, solitary silver dollar in her pocket. In the shadows of the water tower, a man hunkered down against the rough-hewn wood shifts his weight. He is covered in the same dust that coats the town, his face smudged with grime, and his clothes looking like they've been worn for a month of hard riding. He pulls the brim of his hat lower, his eyes, sharp and clear beneath the shadow, watching the woman on the platform. He watches her shoulders, which had slumped in defeat, slowly straighten. He sees her lift her chin, a flicker of defiance in the face of utter desolation. She is alone and penniless, rejected and humiliated, and yet she does not weep. She simply stands, a pillar of quiet dignity in a world that has just kicked her to the curb. And the man in the shadows, a stranger to her and everyone else in this forgotten town, feels a pull of something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Profound, unadulterated respect. There's more to this woman than meets the eye. Before her true worth comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The stakes are etched in the hard lines of the landscape around her. To the east, the unforgiving plains she had just crossed. To the west, mountains that clawed at the sky like the teeth of a saw. Redemption Creek was a precarious island in a sea of wilderness, and she had just been marooned upon it. With a single dollar to her name, she faces a stark choice: starve, beg, or find a way to survive in a town that had already witnessed her humiliation. The stranger under the water tower knows the cruelty of this land better than most. He knows what becomes of lone women with no money and no protection. He watches her take a deep, steadying breath, her small act of courage a stark contrast to the greed and self-interest he had come here to investigate. He thinks of the fat, preening man, Finch, and the cold calculation in his eyes. Then he looks back at the woman, and a decision begins to form, a quiet, dangerous idea taking root in the barren soil of his own weary soul. Alara's world had shrunk to the size of that single silver dollar. It felt heavy in her palm, a cold, metallic reminder of her absolute solitude. She was the daughter of a bookish schoolmaster who had taught her letters and sums, but little of the world's harshness. After both her parents were taken by influenza, she had spent 2 years as a laundress in an overcrowded St. Louis boarding house, the smell of lye and other people's grime becoming the scent of her existence. The advertisement from Jedediah Finch had seemed like a deliverance. He hadn't written of love, but of partnership, of building a life on the frontier. He needed a wife. She needed a home. It was a practical arrangement, and Alara, a pragmatist by necessity, had accepted. She had used every cent she had saved to buy the train ticket, packing her few meager belongings, her mother's locket, her father's favorite book of poetry, 2 changes of clothes, into a simple carpet bag. It was this lack of material wealth that had condemned her in Finch's eyes. He hadn't even asked her name. She found a room for rent above the town's only saloon, a place run by a weary-eyed woman named Martha who demanded 2 bits a night in advance. The room was little more than a closet with a lumpy cot, but it had a door that locked. It was a temporary stay against the inevitable. After paying Martha, Alara's fortune had dwindled to 75 cents. The next day, she walked the dusty street, inquiring about work at the mercantile, the blacksmith's, even the saloon, though she dreaded the thought. She was met with suspicion and dismissal. News of her public rejection had spread like wildfire. She was seen as damaged goods, an object of pity and scorn. The women of the town looked through her, and the men looked at her with an appraisal that made her skin crawl. Meanwhile, the stranger who had watched her from the shadows had also found lodging, though of a much lower sort. He paid a nickel to sleep in the hayloft of the livery stable, owned and operated by the stage line. He called himself Silas and said little else, letting his ragged appearance speak for him. He took on odd jobs, mucking out stalls, polishing harnesses for a few cents and a plate of beans. From this vantage point, he observed the rhythms of Redemption Creek. He saw the station master, a weaselly man named Crenshaw, overcharging passengers for tickets and pocketing the difference. He saw him watering down the whiskey he sold from a barrel in the corner of the office. He saw the horses, overworked and underfed. Silas's face remained a stony mask, but his eyes missed nothing. This was what he had come to find, the rot that had infested the Blackwood stage and freight line from its furthest limbs. He was Silas Blackwood, the sole heir to the entire enterprise, a man who preferred the company of horses to board meetings, and who had heard whispers of corruption at his remote outposts. Instead of sending a letter, he had decided to see for himself, trading his tailored suit for beggar's rags. The town's judgment of Alara was a constant, low hum of cruelty. She overheard snippets of conversation as she passed the mercantile. Finch did right by himself. A woman in a calico dress muttered to her friend. Can you imagine? Arrives with nothing but the dirt on her shoes. The scornful glances were like tiny pebbles thrown at her, each one a fresh sting. Her small reserve of money was nearly gone. Hunger was a constant, gnawing companion. Yet, through it all, she held her head high. She washed her one spare dress in the horse trough behind the saloon at dawn, before anyone was awake to see. She mended a tear at her bodice with thread she'd plucked from the hem, her stitches neat and even. They were small acts of self-preservation, a refusal to dissolve into the destitution that threatened to swallow her. Silas, watching her from the shadows of the livery, saw it all. He saw her dignity as a form of armor, more resilient than any steel. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the dust motes in the air in shades of orange and purple, Alara sat on a bench outside the saloon, trying to read her father's book of poetry. The words blurred before her eyes, her stomach cramping with hunger. She had exactly $1 left, the very same one she'd arrived with, having earned a few cents sweeping the saloon floor, just enough to keep her from spending it. It was her emergency fund, the thin line between her and utter ruin. Across the street, Silas was finishing his work. Crenshaw, the station master, tossed him a nickel. "That's all you're worth," he sneered before locking up the office. Silas looked at the nickel, then at his own empty stomach. He hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, committed to his role. He walked towards the saloon, intending to buy a heel of bread if they'd sell him one. The saloon owner took one look at his filthy clothes and barred the door. "We don't serve vagrants," he said, his voice flat. Alara saw the exchange. She saw the flick of dismissal in the saloon owner's eyes, a look she knew all too well. She saw the stranger, Silas, turn away, his shoulders slumped in a way that looked not like performance, but genuine defeat. He looked tired, hungry, and utterly alone. In that moment, he was not a stranger, but a mirror of her own predicament. Her own hunger, her own fear, her own loneliness, it all coalesced into a single sharp pang of empathy. He sat on the edge of the horse trough, a few yards from her, and stared into the murky water. He hadn't noticed her watching. Alara closed her book. She stood up, her movements deliberate, and walked over to him. He looked up, his eyes wary. She saw in them a deep-seated weariness that went beyond physical hunger. Without a word, she opened her palm. Lying there was her last silver dollar, gleaming softly in the twilight. She held out to him. Silas stared at the coin, then back at her face. He saw no pity there, only a quiet, resolute understanding. "You need it more," he said, his voice a low rasp. "No," she replied, her voice soft but firm. "No one should be denied a meal. Go on, take it." He was the owner of a company that spanned 3 territories, a man whose signature was worth thousands. He could have bought the entire town of Redemption Creek with the money he had in a bank in San Francisco. But here, in this dusty backwater, a destitute woman, a woman publicly shamed and abandoned, was offering him her last dollar. It was the single most decent act he had witnessed in months. It was a drop of pure, clean water in a desert of greed. He hesitated, his throat tight. To refuse would be to insult the profound nature of the gesture. To accept felt like a betrayal of his own hidden reality. "I can't," he whispered. "Please," she insisted, pushing the coin into his hand. Her fingers brushed against his, and the brief contact was surprisingly warm. "There's a small diner at the end of the street. They serve stew. It's not much, but it's hot." He closed his hand around the dollar. It was warm from her skin. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the worn dress and the tired lines around her eyes. He saw a strength and a grace that Jedediah Finch, in his foolish pride, had been utterly blind to. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling inadequate. She simply nodded and walked back to her bench, her pocket now empty, her future more uncertain than ever. But as she sat down, a strange sense of peace settled over her. She had done the right thing. It was a foolish, impractical, and possibly ruinous thing, but it was right. Silas stood there for a long moment, the silver dollar a searing weight in his hand. He looked at the saloon, at the darkened mercantile, at the whole sleeping, judgmental town. Then he looked at the woman on the bench, her head bowed over a book as if she hadn't just given away her last earthly possession. This was no longer just about rooting out corruption. It was about her. He knew then that he couldn't just expose the rot in Redemption Creek. He had to tear it out by the roots and plant something new in its place, something worthy of her dollar. The next morning, Martha, the boarding house owner, was at her door. "Rent's due, honey." 2 bits. Alara's heart sank. She had nothing. I don't have it right now," she admitted, shame coloring her cheeks. "But I can work. I'll scrub every floor in this building." Martha's expression hardened. "Work don't pay for the cot you slept on last night. You've got till noon. Then you're out." The door closed, and the lock clicked with a dreadful finality. Alara sank onto the cot, the full weight of her decision crashing down on her. Her act of charity was about to cost her the only roof she had over her head. Silas used Alara's dollar exactly as she had intended. He went to the small diner and bought a bowl of stew. It was thin and watery, but it was hot. As he ate, he listened. The diner was a hub of gossip. He heard more talk of the jilted bride, and of Crenshaw's latest scheme, charging a new family triple the going rate for a freight shipment. He finished his meal and walked back to the livery stable, his mind working furiously. He found Alara a few hours later, her carpet bag in her hand, standing hesitantly in the dusty street, clearly evicted. Her face was pale, but her chin was still high. He approached her, his demeanor still that of a lowly, stable hand. "Trouble?" he asked, his voice gentle. She forced a small, brittle smile. "A temporary housing issue. Crenshaw's looking for someone to mend a pile of torn mailbags," Silas said, inventing the job on the spot. "Doesn't pay much, but he said it comes with a cot in the back room of the office. It ain't much, but it's a roof." Hope flickered in Alara's eyes. "Truly, go on and ask him," Silas urged. "Tell him Silas sent you. He won't want to pay, but you insist on the room." Alara clutched her bag and hurried to the stage line office. Silas watched her go, then slipped around the back. He found Crenshaw counting a thick wad of bills. "Crenshaw," Silas said, his voice hard, "there's a woman coming to ask about mending those bags in the corner." Crenshaw looked at the pile of ripped canvas. "What about him? You're going to give her the job, and you're going to let her sleep on the cot in the storage room. And you're going to pay her a fair wage for every bag she finishes," Silas said, his voice low and dangerous. Crenshaw laughed. "And why would I do that? I was just going to burn him." Silas took a step closer. He wasn't a large man, but he moved with a coiled intensity that made the bigger man flinch. "Because if you don't," Silas said softly, "I'm going to tell Sheriff Miller about the extra surcharges you've been adding to the freight manifests. I've been watching you, Crenshaw. I've seen your books." He hadn't seen the books, not yet, but it was a calculated guess, and Crenshaw's sudden pallor told him he'd hit the mark. The station master swallowed hard, his bravado vanishing. All right, he muttered. "She can have the damn job." When Alara entered, Crenshaw grumbled and complained, but grudgingly agreed, just as Silas had said he would. She was led to a small, dusty storeroom with a simple cot. It was grimy and smelled of old paper and horse liniment, but to Alara, it was a palace. It was safety. She started on the mailbags immediately, her needle flying with practiced skill. Her stitches were small, strong, and impossibly neat. She was turning something broken into something whole again. Over the next few days, a quiet routine developed. Alara worked tirelessly in the storeroom, and Silas worked in the stable. They shared a space, a silent orbit around the corrupt and oblivious Crenshaw. In the evenings, after Crenshaw had gone to the saloon, Silas would bring her a plate of food, beans and bread he'd saved from his own meager portion. They would sit in the doorway of the livery, the scent of hay around them, and talk. She told him about her father and his love of books. He listened, his gaze steady and attentive, making her feel seen for the first time since she'd arrived. He spoke little of himself, offering only vague stories of working on ranches and long cattle drives. But she began to see past his grimy exterior. She saw a deep well of decency in him, a quiet strength that was the antithesis of Jedediah Finch's blustering pride and Crenshaw's greasy greed. She noticed small things. He always made sure the horses had fresh water before he took any for himself. He found a stray kitten that had been hiding in the hayloft and started sharing his food with it. One afternoon, two rough-looking drifters began to harass her as she crossed the street. Before she could even react, Silas was there. He didn't raise his voice or draw a weapon. He simply stood between her and the men, his presence so immovable, so utterly resolute, that the drifters mumbled an apology and shuffled away. He had protected her, without fanfare or expectation of reward. The connection between them grew in these quiet moments, a delicate thing woven from shared meals, soft-spoken words, and unspoken understanding. He saw her resilience. She saw his integrity. He began to find reasons to be in the office, watching her work. He admired the precision of her hands, the focused set of her jaw. She was not just mending bags. She was rebuilding her life, one stitch at a time. Their fragile peace was shattered when Jedediah Finch swaggered back into town. He had come to finalize the purchase of a new boar and saw Alara leaving the mercantile. She had used her first meager earnings from the mailbags to buy a small bar of soap and a loaf of bread. She felt a sliver of pride, of independence. Finch blocked her path, a cruel smirk on his face. Well, he boomed, ensuring he had an audience. "Look what the cat dragged in. Still haunting this town? I heard you were sewing bags for a living. From bride-to-be to a beggar mending rags. Should have taken my first offer and just left." The public humiliation was a physical blow. The color drained from Alara's face. The loaf of bread suddenly felt like a stone in her hands. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the dust. From across the street, Silas saw the entire exchange. He saw the smirk on Finch's face and the devastating blow it dealt to Alara's hard-won composure. A cold, dangerous fury, unlike anything he had ever felt, settled in his chest. He had seen enough. The time for observation was over. The time for reckoning had arrived. That night, he found her in the storeroom, not sewing, but staring blankly at the wall, the pile of mended bags beside her a monument to a hope that now felt foolish. "He's right," she whispered, her voice hollow. "I'm nothing." Silas knelt in front of her, forcing her to look at him. His hands were calloused and dirty, but his touch was gentle as he tilted her chin up. "He is a blind and ignorant fool," Silas said, his voice vibrating with a raw intensity that startled her. "He wouldn't know true value if it was stamped on a gold ingot and handed to him. What you have, Alara, inside you. That is rarer than any gold. And it's time everyone in this town saw it. He stood up and walked to the telegraph office. He handed the clerk a piece of paper with a coded message and a stack of coins he'd been hiding in his boot. Far more money than a stable hand should have. The message was addressed to a Mr. Alastair Vance in San Francisco, his lawyer and company manager. It was short and direct. Initiate transfer. Full purchase. Redemption Creek branch. Register new ownership deed under the name Alara Vance. Arrive with documents on the morning stage. Prepare for a full audit and dismissal of current station master. SB. The telegraph key began to chatter, sending his command clicking across hundreds of miles of wire. Justice was no longer just an idea. It was now on its way, barreling towards Redemption Creek on iron wheels. He returned to the livery and found Alara. Tomorrow, he said, his eyes burning with a purpose she couldn't comprehend. When a morning stage arrives, I need you to be there, with a dress you arrived in. Just trust me. She looked at him, at this dusty, enigmatic man who had become her only friend, her silent protector. She didn't understand, but she saw the unwavering conviction in his eyes. And after weeks of being let down by the world, she made a choice. She would trust him. The next morning, the air crackled with an unusual energy. Word had spread that a special coach was arriving, carrying a regional director from the Blackwood head office. Crenshaw was in a frenzy, sweating through his shirt as he tried to hide his doctored ledgers and kick dust over the whiskey stains on the floor. The whole town seemed to have turned out, curious to see the city's slicker who was coming to inspect their small, forgotten outpost. Jedediah Finch was there, preening near the front of the crowd, eager to make a good impression on a man of influence. Alara stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, wearing her simple wool dress. She fell out of place, but she held on to Silas's promise. He stood not far from her, leaning against a post, looking as calm and unremarkable as ever. He caught her eye and gave her a subtle, reassuring nod. The stagecoach that thundered into town was unlike any that had stopped in Redemption Creek before. It was a brand-new Concorde, its lacquer gleaming, pulled by four magnificent, perfectly matched gray horses. The door opened, and a man in a sharp, tailored suit and polished boots stepped out. He was the picture of wealth and authority. Crenshaw scurried forward, his hand outstretched, a greasy smile plastered on his face. "Welcome, sir. Welcome to Redemption Creek. Harvey Crenshaw, at your service." The man in the suit, Alastair Vance, ignored Crenshaw completely. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on Silas. A look of immense relief crossed the lawyer's face. He strode directly to the dusty, stable hand, bypassing the gentry, the landowners, and the flustered station master. In front of the entire town, he bowed his head slightly. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice clear and carrying. "It's good to see you, sir. I have the documents you requested." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Jaws dropped. Crenshaw froze, his smile melting into a mask of pure terror. Jedediah Finch's face went white, then a blotchy red. He stared at the man he would have called a vagrant, the man Alara had been seen with, and felt a dawning, sickening horror. Alara's own heart stopped. "Mr. Blackwood?" She looked at Silas Blackwood, and suddenly it all made sense. The quiet authority, the way he moved, the piercing intelligence in his eyes that had been hidden under all that dust and grime. He wasn't a drifter. He was the king of this entire domain, hiding in plain sight. Silas pushed himself off the post and walked to the center of the street, Alastair Vance at his side. He wasn't smiling. His face was like granite. His gaze swept over the stunned townspeople, lingering for a moment on Finch, then settling on the trembling Crenshaw. "Mr. Vance," Silas said, his voice no longer a rasp but a clear, commanding baritone. "The station master's ledger, if you please." Vance produced a thin ledger from his briefcase. "As you suspected, sir," the lawyer announced. "Systematic fraud. Overcharging on freight and passenger fares, selling company supplies, and falsifying wage reports for the last 2 years. The losses amount to several $1,000s. Harvey Crenshaw," Silas declared, his voice ringing with authority. "You are dismissed. Sheriff, you'll find the stolen funds in a loose floorboard beneath his desk. See to it that he is arrested for theft and fraud." The sheriff, who had been watching with wide eyes, stepped forward and took a sputtering Crenshaw by the arm. As he was being led away, Finch, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. He pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face arranged in a mask of remorseful sincerity. He walked right up to Alara. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice dripping with false humility. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. I misjudged you terribly. You are a woman of immense quality, and I see that now. Please, allow me to rectify my egregious error. My offer of marriage still stands." Before Alara could even process the whiplash of his hypocrisy, Silas stepped between them. He was no longer the hunched stable hand. He stood tall, his presence formidable. He looked down at Finch, and the contempt in his eyes was palpable. "Your offer," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. He let the words hang in the stunned silence. "Let me recall your precise words, Mr. Finch. I sent for a bride, not a beggar. You saw a simple dress and an empty purse. You saw nothing of value. You are a man who can only recognize worth when it's announced by a lawyer and accompanied by a fancy stagecoach." He turned his back on the humiliated farmer, dismissing him as utterly insignificant. He walked to Alara, his expression softening as his eyes met hers. "Mr. Vance," he called over his shoulder. "The other document." Alistair Vance stepped forward and unfurled a heavy piece of parchment, the official seal of the Blackwood Stage and Freight Company gleaming at the bottom. "The deed," the lawyer announced, "for the full and complete ownership of the Redemption Creek Station, its stables, its contracts, and all associated property." Silas took the deed from his lawyer. The crowd held its breath. They assumed he was taking formal control. Instead, he turned and held it out to Alara. "This is yours," he said, his voice now gentle, for her ears only, though the whole town strained to hear. "All of it." Alara stared at the document, then at his face, her mind reeling. I don't understand." Silas's voice grew stronger, ringing out for all to hear. "This woman," he declared, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, "arrived in your town with nothing. You judged her, you scorned her, and you cast her out. And with her last dollar, a coin she needed for her own survival, what did she do? She bought a meal for a man she thought was lower than herself. She didn't invest in property or stock. She invested in human dignity." He pushed the deed gently into her hands. "This," he said, his voice dropping again, becoming an intimate, rumbling promise, "is the return on her investment. The Blackwood Stage line is hereby repaying its debt." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of overwhelming, incomprehensible gratitude. She looked at the deed in her hands, the elegant script spelling out her own name, Alara Vance, proprietor. Then she looked up at Silas Blackwood. She didn't see the powerful owner of a vast company. She saw the quiet, kind man who had shared his beans with her, who had protected her from bullies, who had seen her when no one else would. "But," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know the first thing about running a stage line." A slow smile, the first true smile she had ever seen from him, spread across Silas's face, transforming his entire demeanor. It reached his eyes, crinkling the corners and erasing the last of his weariness. "I do," he said softly, "and I was hoping you might consider hiring me on, perhaps as a partner." The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with a meaning that went far beyond business. It was a proposal more real, more profound than any Jedediah Finch could have ever conceived. It was an offer not of ownership, but of equality. A partnership built not on a contract of convenience, but on a foundation of a single silver dollar given freely from the heart. In the quiet aftermath, as the stunned crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves, Alara and Silas stood together in the middle of the street. The dust settled around them. Jedediah Finch had vanished, swallowed by the shame of his public exposure. The sheriff was locking a pale Crenshaw in the town jail. For the first time, The air in Redemption Creek didn't taste of disappointment. It tasted of possibility. Alara looked down at the deed, her name written in bold, confident ink. Then she looked at the dilapidated stage office, with its peeling paint and dusty windows. It was no longer a symbol of her servitude, mending bags in the back room. It was hers. A small, determined smile touched her lips. She looked at Silas, who was watching her, his expression patient and open. "A partner?" she asked, a hint of playful challenge in her voice. "I'll have to see your qualifications, Mr. Blackwood." He chuckled a low, warm sound. "I have some experience with horses, and I'm told I'm a fair judge of character." His eyes held hers, and in their depths, she saw the promise of a shared future, a life built on mutual respect and hard-won trust. Days later, the stage office was transformed. The windows were washed, the floors swept clean. New ledgers sat open on the main desk. Alara, no longer in a travel-worn dress, but in a practical, new work skirt, was directing two newly hired men as they unloaded fresh supplies. She moved with a confidence that seemed to have been waiting just beneath the surface, unleashed by the knowledge of her own worth. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway of her office, a manifest in her hand, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she finished giving an order, she glanced up and caught him watching. The frantic energy of the past week fell away, leaving a space of profound, peaceful silence between them. He offered her that same slow, genuine smile. "It's a lot of work," she said, gesturing to the bustling activity. "The best things always are," he replied. He walked over to her, wiping his hands on a rag. "That dollar you gave me," he said, his voice low. "It was the best investment I ever made." Alara's smile matched his, and it was by far the best dollar I ever spent. He reached out, not to take the manifest, but to gently brush a stray piece of straw from her hair. The simple gesture was more intimate than an embrace. They stood there for a moment on the threshold of her new life, the bustling work of the stage line a backdrop to their quiet understanding. Outside, the sun beat down on Redemption Creek, but inside the office, under the sturdy roof that was now hers, a new partnership had already begun its long and promising journey. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.